Are you a fan of the NHL? Are you excited for the NHL draft? Are you wondering what players your team should draft and what players they should avoid? If you answered yes to any of those questions, then this is the video for you. But it is important that you stick around to the end of the video because I have important information that you can only get right at the end of the video. So make sure you stick around to hear all the stuff you need to know about the 2022 NHL draft. Recently, there has been some debate about who the best player in this draft class actually is. Some people think it is Uri Slafkovsky, other people think it is Shane Wright. I have pretty much always been on the Shane Wright side, and I still believe that Shane Wright is the best player available in this draft class, despite Slafkovsky's recent success in international tournaments. Slafkovsky, for me, is still a really good player. I just look at his entire sample size over the season, and his play in Finnish Liga was good, but it didn't really impress me that much to the point where I think he realistically should go first overall. Shane Wright, on the other hand, is a player who hasn't really impressed me that much either, considering he is probably going to go first overall. He's still a very solid prospect and absolutely is, I believe, the best player in this draft, but don't expect him to be the next Patrice Bergeron. A lot of people are making that comparison. I don't really see it. A guy I have compared him to a bit in the past is the Sharks centerman Logan Couture. Now, I'm a bit biased because I am a Sharks fan, but I think with a guy comparing him to Couture, he's a reasonably good two-way forward. He is reasonably defensively responsible, and I think Shane Wright's offensive upside is relatively similar to what Couture has put up over his career. Although I do think Wright has a better shot and has a little bit better shot selection in terms of where he's actually trying to shoot on the goalies. So I do think Wright will score more goals in the NHL than a guy like Logan Couture. Either way, though, he is definitely the best player available in this draft class, in my eyes. The best defensemen in this draft class are without a doubt David Jiricek and Simon Nemec. Some people have Nemec ahead of Jiricek, some people have it the other way around. Personally, I like Jiricek just a little bit more, but these guys are razor thin close. With Jiricek, you're getting a guy who is big, can play physical, is a good skater, and is just overall, I think, going to be a guy who contributes to your team pretty solidly, even if he isn't putting up crazy point totals. I don't think Jiricek is necessarily going to be a top power play quarterback, but he could play a very solid top four role and maybe get some second power play unit time while putting up 25 to 35 points in a typical season. Nemec is more of the high upside of the two. He's a guy that does have top power play potential and could maybe put up 45, 50 point seasons, although I think his defensive game and overall game is not quite as good as Jiricek. The main concern with Nemec that I have is he does make some pretty weird decisions at times, particularly with icing the puck when he has better options. Now, if you are hoping to look for a new goalie prospect in this year's draft, you're kind of out of luck. There are no high-profile goalies in this draft class at all. The highest-ranked goaltenders tend to be Tyler Brennan and Topias Lennonen. Neither of those guys, I think, have considerably high upside. Lennonen has a very outside shot, I think, at becoming an NHL starter, but that is pretty unlikely, and generally speaking, it is hard to protect goalies, so I don't like to scout goalies as much, so I can't say too much about him, but goalies are voodoo, and generally speaking, there are no really safe slam dunk goalie picks in this draft class. Now for a couple of players that I feel are overrated, and these are two centermen in Connor Geekie and Marco Kasper, and these are fairly similar players, but I'll get into Geekie first. Geekie is a guy with a little bit of higher upside of the two players. I think he's an excellent playmaker, and that could translate to the NHL level, but his skating is a major issue for me. A lot of people have him going in the top half of the first round, and to me, his skating is just not good enough to justify a pick that high. Marco Kasper's skating is a lot more solid, and he is my preferred player of the two guys. However, With him, the upside is rather limited, I think. I see him as a third line center who can get grindy goals, go to the net front, get tips, deflections, that type of player. And Geeky is kind of that type of player as well. Both of these guys, realistically, I see being as third line centers. But Casper, especially, who is I've seen as high as going 8 in mock drafts. That is just really high for a guy with that kind of upside. Now for a couple players that I think are criminally underrated in this year's draft class. The first is Moose Jaw Warriors winger Jagger Firkus. And Firkus doesn't just have one of the best names in the draft, he also has one of the best shots in the draft, if not the best shot. In fact, I am of the mindset that he does have the best shot in the draft, and he's a guy that I could easily see scoring 30 goals in the NHL. He's not a guy that might get a ton of assists, but as the season went along, his playmaking did improve quite substantially, so he could easily be like a 30 goal, 60 point type guy who you play solidly in your top 6. Grudinin is perhaps even more underrated than Firkus, though, because I've seen him going as late as 88 in mock drafts, and quite frankly, that is insultingly low for Grudinin. He's a guy who at least should be in your first round, and that is just for the simple fact that he is arguably the best skating defenseman in this draft class, and arguably the best skater, period, in this draft class. He's extremely mobile, very explosive first step, and very good at coming out of turns quickly and pivoting. He's also a reasonable puck carrier and has a good eye for passing lanes in the offensive zone. I do think his offensive game needs to improve a little bit in order to really hit his upside, which I think is easily as a top power play unit guy, given he is extremely mobile and very good at walking that blue line, keeping pucks in the zone. Some guys that are rather risky but have very high ceilings are guys like Christian Kyrou and Gleb Trikazov. Starting off with Lane Hutson, he is another extremely mobile defenseman, although he is very undersized. And while Grudinin is small, he is pretty persistent and tough on the puck. Hutson doesn't really have that skill set. He's probably the smallest defenseman that will get drafted this year at 5'8", although he is relatively reasonably responsible on defense as well, but he's going to have to get stronger and faster in a straight line if he's really going to work out at the NHL level. Östlund is a dynamic, fast-paced, extremely good playmaker. Although, like Hudson, he also has small player problems, and that is my main concern with projecting him to the NHL. However, he is a pretty good skater, which does help in this category a little bit. Christian Kyrou is another high-paced, dynamic offensive defenseman. In fact, he is arguably one of the best defensemen in the draft class at offense in general. However, his defensive game is kind of a disaster, and that is really the main concern with him. If his defense doesn't improve, he likely doesn't have a spot in the NHL. Finally, we have Gleb Trikazov. Now, this is a guy you may have heard of before, especially if you are a fan of Will Scouch. And the thing with Trikazov is that he is extremely dynamic offensive threat, especially with the puck on his stick in the offensive zone. He's also reasonably good in transition. He's an excellent playmaker who has a decent shot as well, but his defensive game is virtually non-existent at times. He's another player who is going to have to learn to play defense and be at least engaged defensively and trying to do things in the defensive zone before he'll earn a role in an NHL lineup. Now for some safe picks, and these are players that I think have relatively decent floors but don't have a ton of NHL upside. And that is Noah Warren, Isaiah George, Marco Casper, and Cutter Gauthier. Now, George and Warren are both defensive defensemen who don't bring a ton of offense and will not bring a lot of offense to the NHL level. Marco Kasper, as I already discussed, is a solid player who I think will likely play as a third-line center and is a reasonably safe bet to play that role, but probably won't play in a top 6 role. Cutter Gauthier is a guy that I think is also a little bit overrated. He's a very solid player, again, a safe pick, a guy who has a lot of skills, but I think his skating is a little bit of an issue, and I don't really think his points production this year quite indicated his actual uh, skills with the puck. I think his numbers were a little bit inflated. One thing you might have been expecting based off the title of this video is a player ranking. Now, I actually just released my final top 100 player rankings yesterday, so I will leave that video right here.